My name's Kieran Cook. I'm a terrible journalist from the Times in London, and also for my sins, I'm one of those who is charged with looking after the journalists here. Perhaps His All Holiness will tell me what sins I've committed to merit this role. But I'd like to address maybe all the panel, really, but because I'm a little confused. We've spent quite a few days here looking around. We've been very lucky, and we went round the lower Ninth, and we went to various places in New Orleans. And the conclusion seems to be that Katrina was not, as was first broadcast in the media, perhaps, an act of God, but it was a man-made disaster. That water was actually funneled through these navigation channels into the city, which were built by the Corps, that the levees failed, and resulting in this loss of life and loss of livelihoods. Then yesterday we were down in the bayou, and people were telling us again that it was navigation channels both built by the Corps but also built by the oil and gas industry, which are responsible for eroding the wetlands. We were told that in fact there's 7 years left, and then the wetlands are more or less a dead environmental area with huge consequences, not only environmentally but for the economy as well. And I suppose the conclusion that I've reached is that the Corps and others have served the interests of the economy and the oil and gas industry in particular very well, but the environment very badly. Perhaps you could ask that. Thank you.
Kieran, thank you. I'm going to direct that to our two American colleagues, sorry, to the General and then to Gerald.
Okay, thank you, Kieran. That's a great question. I think that your observation on what part is natural disaster and what part is man-made. There's no question that in the country, as the country was developing, that there was a lot of pressure on that development, and the way that it's translated in our country through our government is that projects are looked at, they have local sponsors, we put those projects together. Ultimately, the administration and the Congress of the United States says, let's either build those projects or not. So there's a lot of contributors to that, to what actually ends up being built. One of the things we found down here in New Orleans was that we had a project on the books. It had been changed over the years, but it had never really been finished. So that's another piece of it, I think, that contributed, is some of the way, and we've really looked at this as a nation. We have a lot of projects that are started, but they take many, many years to finish. We really have to look at our things as systems. So one of our lessons learned is to look at things as a system, try and bring them to completion as quickly as can be. So a lot of lessons there, but I think there's no question there was a combination of things that contributed to this disaster here. Jerry, over to you.
Thank you.
I would agree with General Van Antwerp that hindsight is very good. And if we could have predicted, for example, the environmental disasters that took place in the 60s, in 1940 or 1930, we might not have used dilution as the solution to pollution. But we weren't smart enough to do that. And at the time that the coast was being developed, 35% of the nation's oil and gas comes from coastal Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi. It's important. At that point in time, there were people out there to try and protect it. People were not willing to control the land use, and there's an interesting phenomenon that we'll talk about this afternoon, is that in the federal system in the United States, land use is a local responsibility. And so where people go and what they do with that land is not dictated by the federal government or programs, it's dictated at the local level. And as General Van Antwerp said, I know of no project that's been built without the approval of the governor of that particular state and with the support of local sponsors who wanted it to be there. The question is, we've seen since the 1960s the expansion of who is a stakeholder. Is a stakeholder limited to the people that live there, or is a stakeholder limited to or expanded to include people throughout the nation who recognize the value of whatever that particular resource is? So I don't think we would do, I was once asked when I was on the Mississippi River Commission by the president of the Mekong River Commission, would we have redone, if we knew what we know now about the Mississippi, would we have done it, would we have done navigation on the Mississippi? Would we have built levees? And the answer is we would have built them because navigation has been terribly important. This is, again, the largest port in terms of tonnage in the United States, right out our window. This is an area that's been developed and needs those levees. But we would have done it in an entirely different way that would have facilitated this room for the rivers, dealing with nature, providing for the challenges that we faced. And nobody really understood that these canals for the oil and gas rigs, which were local, were going to have this effect. And we didn't open our eyes quick enough to really notice that we were losing the wetlands. The biologists talked about it, but nobody else did, and that's an unfortunate issue.
Actually, you get a similar problem in India. The part of that problem is the Indian Constitution of 1947-48 is unclear as to which bits of water are state responsibilities and which are federal responsibilities. And so actually doing anything involves an immensely complex exercise. Carl.
I do want to give a slightly different response. I think it is absolutely correct that when we built Fort Peck Dam, we didn't understand what we were doing to the wetlands of Louisiana. When we started the oil and gas development south of New Orleans, we did not understand what those canals would do to the wetlands. But it is not good enough to say if we had known then what we know now, we would have done it differently, because we are today doing things in exactly the same fashion on a rather broad scale when we know better. It is not enough to say, well, only the biologists were talking about it. Well, if the biologists were talking about it, something else was happening. They were talking, and somebody wasn't listening. And we still have a problem, which is those who make decisions either cannot or do not listen to information about the long-term systemic consequences of their decision. And I will argue that, yes, this is partly because of self-interest and short-sightedness and greed. But I'm also going to argue it's because we have fundamentally wrong metaphors in our head. And we think that our job is to limit and control natural systems. And as long as we have that metaphor in our head, we will make mistakes, and we will not act even on knowledge we have.
Could I make one quick response, just to say that I was in the 50s up in the state of Missouri when they were talking about the Missouri River dams, and one of the big participants in this was U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who thought this was going to be a panacea for lots of things that were happening. Nobody had figured out some of the many challenges to rare and endangered species. It's not just the engineer or just not the politician. It's we as a corporate community have this belief that we can change anything. And I think what we're learning now, and I would contend that there are lots of things going on here, the state plan for coastal Louisiana takes that into account. We can't do business as usual. We've got to go in a different direction.
Okay. I can see a question here. Sorry, you're all blinded by the light. At least I'm blinded by the light. Sorry. Yeah, they are.
John Hart from Boston University School of Theology. Do we have two of us coming up?
No, sorry, on you go.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to stack you.
My question came up actually during Professor Galloway's presentation, and I didn't find an answer. I think I had a disturbing answer in General Van Antwerp's presentation. And was somewhat reassured by some of the comments made by Carl, but I think the question also relates to the Mekong Delta, so I'll incorporate all four of you in this one. The question was, when the first presentation talked about the 100-year flood, I wondered if that 100 years now, that figure changes because we're now in this period of chaotic climate change. And then General Van Antwerp said that Katrina is a 200-year flood, and that the current system being put in, that'll be finished in 2011, is not adequate for another Katrina. And it struck me during the first presentation, and again in the generals, that Katrina becomes a new mark. And as we start looking at the possibilities now, it would seem that perhaps, as a non-scientist, that it would occur more than every 200 years, that because of the climate change and so forth. And this might also have implications for the Mekong. In other words, how far, if we just look at past information, and that we have 100 years from now, we can meet that, but maybe this is not a 200-year event with Katrina. And then secondly, a very specific question to General Van Antwerp in a different area, but since you're in charge of the overall system, as I understand it. On the Columbia River between Oregon and Washington, scientific studies a few years ago said the only way to save salmon was by breaching the 4 dams on the lower Snake River. And these were scientific studies. There were 2 of them, the PATH report and its follow-up. The breaching of the dams, they said, is the only hope for survival that the salmon have. And I know some previous administrations have refused to look into that. There have been political and economic factors coming in. I was wondering if the Corps and others are looking at reevaluating that to restore the salmon, which also would have economic benefit for both native peoples along the river as well as for other fishes and the general economy of the Columbia and Snake system. Thank you.
Right, let's start with the General.
Thank you. It was John. John, thank you very much for that question. I think, first of all, we are doing watershed studies out on the Columbia. And there's been talk of whether or not the dams that were built back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are still serving their purpose and what's their impact. Of course, there's a lot of different we call them multi-use facilities. They're not just for fish, they're not just for navigation, they're not just for flood control, they're for hydropower and water supply and all that. So the study has got to be comprehensive on all of those things. What we've done, and I'm sure you're aware, is with fish ladders and other things to try and have your cake and eat it too, I would say, to be able to provide hydropower and navigation and recreation at the same time be able to live in, with the fish being able to transport either by mechanical means, a fish ladder, or some other way. I think it's worthy to look at and to see. As we look around the country, the 610 dams I spoke of, would that number be better at 300, or what is the right thing? But I think it takes a watershed study, and that's what we're doing. We're actually doing a lot of watershed studies across the nation to try and now look holistically. We've done that a lot on the Mississippi River, but we really haven't done it in the other water systems like the Columbia. So we're taking that on, and the Congress is supporting us to be able to get started in those studies. So thanks, but great point.
Dr. Tuk, do they do these things better in Vietnam? The mayor of this city recently went to Cuba and came back saying how well their hurricane warning system operated.
In fact, in Vietnam, Vietnam is a very disaster-prone country. We have more than thousands years experience in natural disaster preparedness, especially in the north. We have very much experience. However, in the south, in the Mekong Delta, usually typhoon does not hit in the very low altitude part of the country. However, recent years, there is some typhoon landed in the Mekong River Delta. Because of the living standard is very low, the house of the people is very temporary. So if the typhoon or hurricane like Katrina hit the Mekong Delta, I think the whole delta will be, people in the whole delta will be swept away. So it's a huge disaster. But up to now, there is not yet. When I talked to the people on sea level rise of about 1 meter, they said that that is by the year 2100, we can find a way to adapt to that. Surely we can find a way. However, if typhoon like Nagis, typhoon hit Myanmar, come to the delta, then there's no way to escape. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul.
Yes, I'm one of the journalists who yesterday Paul Brown from The Guardian in London, looked at the delta. And we were told by a group of local people and also by naturalists and so on, that there is no hope for New Orleans unless the marshes can be replenished. And the way the marshes can be replenished is by diverting the Mississippi so that the sediment gets onto the marshes and they regrow themselves to combat both the sinking of the marshes and the sea level rise. And there seemed to be a problem with the Corps of Engineers, who they described as, I think the figure was 96% in favor of navigation, 3% in favor of flood protection, and 1% in favor of ecology, which seemed to me a little unfair, but hey. And I just wondered whether the General feels that he can actually save New Orleans, or whether the central problem is that you can't replenish the marshes with your current policies, and whether the sensible thing for New Orleans to do would be to back up and move back 50 miles or so, or perhaps further. Thank you.
I'm sorry to do this, General. I think that was aimed at you as well.
Okay.
That you were used
No
to
problem,
being aimed
no
at.
problem. Thank you, Paul. I think one of the big issue in diversions is what is the sediment flow coming down? And you all have heard in this conference that the sediment has been greatly reduced over the years that actually comes down to this area. The other thing, we are looking at a number of diversions. One of the things that happens when you divert the water out is you change the flows in the river itself. You change the water quality, the ability to transport, you change the water velocity. So there's a lot of factors with a diversion, so you've got to know that the science is going to make it work. I think it is a very challenging science of how you actually grow a wetland that will sustain and be a mitigating factor in a storm event. There was considerable wetland here that was lost in Katrina, and you've already talked about those numbers. A lot of that wetland really, I guess, was not anchored to the point that it really took the edge off the event. It was just swept out. So unless we build the right kinds, unless these diversions really work and you're able to grow something, that will be a substantial factor in mitigating the surge. We're open to it. We are looking at diversions. I think there's I see my friend Garrett Graves here, there's a very comprehensive plan to look at things as barrier islands and other things. We are open to all those things. And thank you, Paul, for saying we're not 1% on the ecology. We're much more than that, but it's a very complicated system.
Jay?
And this is not new information. Back in 1990, the Corps of Engineers, with the support of the state of Louisiana, opened a diversion just to the south of here at Carnarvon to begin experimenting and try and find out this information. Another one to the north here of where we are at Davis Pond. There are others under consideration right now. There's been a marked success in taking and showing how marshland can be recreated. At the Wax Lake outlet, which is on the Atchafalaya system, there's actual land there that you can walk on that's been created by downstream movement of sediment. Some of the sediment that goes into dredging the channel can be placed on the side and create marshes. And the state is working very hard with the Corps. There are issues, as General Van Antwerp has said, that make it not always easy, because you create, by doing one thing, you create other problems, and it is not inexpensive. And so how do you put all those together? But there's a lot of science going into it, and the people in this room, many of them, Garrett Graves, Mark Davis, have been working on this for decades, literally, and trying to nail it down. And I think it's moved forward a lot in the last 5 years.
Actually, there's a lot of science in the room, but there's also a lot of theology and thought and philosophy in the room, and it seems to me the trick is combining the two. Question here, and then we're going to go to John Grimm, who I saw earlier. Yep.
Yeah, my name is Fritz Slengerman. I'm from the United Nations Environment Programme. I have a quick question. Balancing influence and powers in a situation like this is normally being done also by reviewing the procedures and decision-making around environmental impact assessment. And those procedures and decision-making are subject of a discussion in many places in the world. But has there been any review of these procedures after Katrina? Have people been looking at adapting these procedures to create this balance instead of focusing exclusively on the core? Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to do something which I hate doing. I'm going to combine a couple of questions because we're getting short. John, next question.
John Grimm, Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the Divinity School. I wanted to follow off of Carl's remark about the metaphors that drive us, or the metaphors that we use to explain situations to ourselves, and to parallel three metaphors that I've heard operative in this panel, which I thank all of the panelists very much for your remarks. First, the metaphor from Dr. Took, the sense of we will adapt, or we will not be able to endure in that Mekong Delta, the substantial hurricane that he conjectured for us, this sense of adaptation. Then the metaphor that's undergirding our gathering, restoring balance. And I think in light of some of the remarks yesterday, especially Professor Minnick Rossing's challenging presentation, that we live in a dynamic system. In the sense of restoring balance, we really need to reconsider that. The third metaphor, General Van Antwerp, I wanted to draw on your early remark of characterizing, and I believe you put it in the context of the Army, but I believe it's a metaphor which I feel driving also our relationship to these hydraulic projects, namely persistent conflict. And it strikes me that that has been a characterization of so much of our human-earth relations of this industrial period, that we are in a conflictual relationship with nature. And again, you did suggest it was a military, in that sense, an army perspective, and maybe you didn't intend to mix the metaphor, but I'm seriously struck by we are in an age now where we are mixed by the metaphors that we are using to describe these situations. And I would suggest that persistent conflict is not helpful, that resilience is what we attempt to engender in these activities. And so persistent resilience, I believe, captures some of what you're after, but it also opens us to what Carl was calling for, a sense of natural systems and our relationship to them, opening ourselves in both ways. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take one more.
Fred Kruger, National Religious Coalition on Creation Care, San Francisco. My question is similar to Dr. Jim's. What would you say is the worldview that shaped the human structures that led to Katrina? And explicitly here, there are always values subsumed into a worldview. Are they just purely utilitarian, or is there some sense of respect for the land? Because once every value, because it has values in it, has to be made apparent. Otherwise, there's a certain blindness in our relationship with the land. Maybe you could address that as you see fit.
That's a splendid question. Let's go the other way down the panel. Gerald.
That's the question of the day. I think that the challenge that we've seen in the last 3 decades in the United States is the awareness that we have value responsibilities and not just those that are connected to program responsibilities. For so long in the process by which our government operates, a proponent for something moves through the process and gets what he or she wants eventually, they would hope. In the 80s, as we began to move into the environmental movement, into a broader social context, people began to question the values. It's very clear New Orleans was built for, or protected to meet the desires and needs of the people who live here and who saw it as an economic engine. And I will make one comment that the guidelines under which the United States operates in its water development, beginning in 1983, was poised as the benefits, economic benefits must exceed the costs, and that environment and public safety and social was not part of the process. This had been part of an earlier calculus for dealing with water resource projects. I'm happy to report that in 2007, in the face of Katrina and reacting to it, the United States Congress changed that and said it is the policy, at least as far as the Congress is concerned, that public safety, environmental values, and economic benefits all have to be taken into account. And the process is underway to make that reality right now. That's a sea change in the way people are looking at things, so that values do play a role in the decisions, values that go beyond the economic benefits.
Thank you. Carl? Answer, there were 3 questions, so pick.
I'll pick the last one too. It was the most provocative. I guess I think that we're at a moment when the issue is not just, or isn't purely a values issue, although values are very important. The values of the world's great religious traditions. Let's just begin with thou shalt not murder. It's pretty universally accepted. But when it emerged, it meant I can't kill you because you were about as far away as I could actually kill anybody. I mean, I couldn't kill somebody at the back of the room very easily. I was probably going to miss. We haven't thought through the implication of the fact that I can kill somebody by getting in my SUV and driving to work and changing the climate, and that causes a typhoon in Vietnam. What does that injunction, thou shalt not murder, mean when I can kill unintentionally thousands of miles away, perhaps decades from now, and thanks to science, I now know it. I now know that my instrumental behavior has ethical consequences over time and space that we haven't created a culture that knows how to take into account. And I think it is too glib to point the finger at institutions and say you have the wrong values. These institutions were not built to project those values over time and space in the way that science now enables us to do.
I mean, you cannot hold cigarette manufacturers responsible for the deaths from cancer until the moment they knew what the cigarettes were doing. You cannot hold the fossil fuel industry responsible for climate change until the moment they knew what they were doing, in any kind of ethical sense. And so I agree with you. The question is, we now know what we're doing. We know more of what we're doing. And so that's when the ethical demands kick in. Dr. Took.
Yes, for the Mekong River Delta, the philosophy of the people there is to live with flood, because there is no way to have the flood control structure to protect from flooding. And the people call flood in the Mekong Delta is not flood, but floating water. They make use of the flood, and their income in the flood season is much more higher than in the normal season, in the dry season. Better fishing is better than rice production. This is because we are not afford, and there's no possibility to build dike or to build flood protection area. The best practice in this region is evacuation. When the typhoon comes, they can evacuate about 100,000 people within 1 day from the flood, from the forecasted flood landed area. And they are now used to flood and natural disaster.
Thank you. General, the last word.
I think your values are reflected in a couple of ways. Number one, what do you do with where we're going in the future? So those values will be reflected in what we build tomorrow and where we're heading and what we're looking at. And then they're also reflected in how do you change what you built yesterday to now move into there. And I'll just give an example. A good many of our projects in the Corps of Engineers over the last 50 years have been single purpose. A lot of them were primarily for flood control. That was the main thing. I think you would say out of that that the value was human life and protection and risk reduction. Many of our facilities now, we're undergoing what we call a reevaluation report to look at the multi-uses of that. What's its environmental impact? What's its safety impact or flood control? What does it do to the ecology? What does it do to providing for water quality and quantity? So I think we're seeing that. In a lot of areas in the United States, and I'll use the Everglades as an example, we are on putting forth a massive effort to actually undo what we've done, where we dug a lot of drainage canals and tried to, in a word, drain the swamp so that we could develop there and provide for the population. Now we're trying to restore those Everglades because we now understand it's important to the nation ecologically, and where fowl and fauna and everything else reside. So I think you're seeing these values, and I think ultimately they'll be lived out in what we do in the future and how we retrofit the past.
Thank you. You know what Brits are like. You can never get through a session without one of them quoting Churchill, so I'm going to do it. He said in the very late 30s, I think 1939, he said, now we live in the age of consequences. And the age of consequences was actually also the title of a Center for New American Security publication 18 months ago, 2 years ago, on the consequences, on the relationship between national security and climate change. And I've had the privilege of working with a group of senior officers from around the world led by an Indian Air Marshal, because it seems to me essential that we involve the military of the world fully in the struggle against climate change. It would be bizarre to face this kind of human challenge and not to involve the skills, the energy, the research of the military. So I think you've done extremely well. The panel have done brilliantly, and we've solved enough to get us through to lunch, and then we'll return to the problems this afternoon. But I want you to thank the panel very much, what I thought was very good stuff.